what I'll be trying to talk about today is essentially a research agenda or direction that I've been working in or towards over the last, say, 4 or 5 years, and hopefully I'll keep on working or looking into this for a long time. And essentially it's looking at how we might be using technology to support prevention and promotion of mental health. So prevention of mental health disorders and promotion of mental health. And I'll tell you a little more about what I mean by that in a bit. But I really wanted to talk about what we see as a great potential for technology to enable these kinds of interventions that essentially help people develop the competencies and habits that then are able to reduce the chances of mental health illness developing later, especially if you intervene in early childhood, for example, as well as correlate with the well-being more broadly. So in this sense, if you're doing prevention or promotion, you're not only reducing something bad happening, but you're actually helping people feel better or get better life outcomes generally. So what I'll try and do in the talk is just outline the vision of what we see as the possible steps towards it. There isn't that much technology that would be focusing on these kinds of interventions so far. And then also just see how much overlap there is with, for example, the sensing urban science work that you're doing here. Also because prevention science looks at interventions on population level, so one would expect that there is some overlap, but at the same time these interventions are very localized and individualized, essentially delivered to each person, so how you might be looking into it. So before we get there, I just thought I'll share my weird background and where I come from. So I have a psychology, sociology, and theoretical computer science degrees. So in some ways, I'm very schizophrenic, and I always was able to pretend that if I'm in computer science, I'm a psychologist, and if I'm a psychologist, I'm a computer science person, which is also why I got the PhD in human-computer interaction. Today, though, I'll be talking more like a psychologist. So a lot of the projects that you'll see today or that we'll talk about are using really simple technologies, but technologies that are designed in ways that really should fit into the lives of people that are using it. So it's about not contributing a new technical achievement, but more about contributing a system that really fits in well with what people need and, for example, is being used and could be used. And that's not because I believe that there's no point in developing these more intricate technologies, but because it's a really early research agenda, so it kind of makes sense to figure out what we can do with simple things before we move on to more complicated machine learning and so on. As well as it might make sense to figure out where do the simple technologies fail before we start developing something more complicated. So the projects or the papers that I'll be drawing on, there's a bunch of them, and I might reference these as we go along. There's also been a lot of people that got involved along the way that I'll have a long list at the end of the talk. But for now, just so you see. I wanted to start with talking a little bit about what the difference is between treatment and prevention. Who's from the audience kind of would think that they know this already? Just so I know how deep I should go into it. Maybe? Yeah? Okay. This is just a slide to say mental health is a big problem. There's a lot of mental health disorders out there. Even in developed countries, often people who need help do not get help. And there's also a lot of research that looks at how technology could be used in support of interventions. However, most of what we've seen so far has been looking at treatment, so essentially supporting therapies or interventions once people already have developed some mental health illness, but much less work has been focused on these promotion, prevention interventions. So if we're talking about the treatment, I'm sure you know a lot about these different programs or applications where there's a lot of work that's essentially looked at supporting bipolar disorder therapy, building therapies, ECBT courses and so on. There's also a lot of work recently looking at digital phenotyping, which often is trying to look at the data traces that we're leaving behind us. And the argument there is often we could use these to do early detection of things potentially going wrong, but very rarely so far it seems that these detection approaches have been actually linked with the therapies or interventions for many good reasons. And there's also actually a lot of work on prevention and promotion, but that often does not happen within the technology sphere so far. So if we're talking about prevention, the most used definition that I know of is looking at reducing the risk factors and strengthening protective factors, and I'll tell about what that means, with the aim of leading to reduced probability of mental health illness later on, but then also improving life well-being as we go along. And if this is a table that came from a World Health Organization report on what are the protective factors that are really well established in the literature. And you can see that across these, there's a lot that are not environmental based. These are factors that are in some ways internal and malleable. They're about competencies, about personal skills, about personal mindsets towards how they interpret and work with the world. So what that means is also that these are things that could be potentially changed by psychosociological interventions as opposed to changing the economics of a country, for example. There's also growing interest in prevention interventions more broadly. So this is just looking at the number of publications, not cumulative, but like year by year, that have social emotional learning, which is essentially the area that I look at of prevention. And you can see a relatively steep curve. There is similar interest in prevention in terms of policymakers and national governments, because there's a recognized push that the moment people are already ill or have a mental disorder, it's much harder and much more expensive to actually treat them. And you can see things like this from NHS-based reports talking about if we were to meet the demand of the scaling mental health problems, these are the types of numbers of staff and extra funding that we'd need, which is why we need to start focusing on prevention in support of the existing treatments. Just bits and pieces from via WHO and OECD, all of them kind of over the last 5 years pointing to this area. And sorry for such a long introduction, I just wanted to show the combined evidence or push over the last decade or so that really seems to motivate that work. And also for me, it's interesting then that despite all this, there's actually very little work that I can see in HCI that would be looking at technology-enabled prevention interventions as such. So what I'll be trying to do in the rest of the talk is quickly talk about some of the existing mechanisms of change that we know of from, say, 30, 40 years of work in developmental psychology and elsewhere. Talk about a design framework, so essentially what is it that seems to be underpinning, what's the learning science background that seems to be underpinning interventions that help people develop these competencies. Talk about 2 case studies when we've tried to put that notion of situated interventions into practice, and then finish off with just pointers to some of the ongoing work, which is all still aligned with the bigger notion of situated interventions and essentially thinking about the new models in which technology could enable interventions being built. So just to start with, if I say social emotional learning or social emotional competencies, I'd imagine that most of you have not really heard about it as much. So again, there's a little overview of what this actually means. We've had a paper in Tokai 2015 that tries to review both of the world, so essentially review the 30, 40 years of prevention science literature, where there's a lot of evidence-based curricula already out there, but also these curricula have a number of challenges, and then talk about how technology might be useful. So just talking about what social emotional learning means, it's generally an umbrella skill or an umbrella word that encompasses a number of essentially competencies that people can have. Some of these can be, for example, self-management or self-regulation, Often they're broken down into types of actions or activities that people can do. And there's also a lot of literature about how these skills are important and what does it mean that they're protective. So, for example, measures of emotion regulation or self-regulation that are administered to kids that are roughly 4 years old. Do you know the Marshmallow Experiment? Yeah, so measures like a Marshmallow Experiment and others have been then shown to predict important life outcomes at the age of 25, such as whether or not the child gets incarcerated, how high a degree or education they achieve, how wealthy and healthy they are. And these correlations were essentially of the same strength as those of IQ or the family socioeconomic status and a lot of the other kind of structural factors that we know are problematic. So if anyone wants to look into this, I always say this is the traditional HCI study where someone decided to do a thing they can do over a summer, and they took 1,000 people and followed them from birth to 32 years of age and like measured them over the time, and then we're able to show that child self-control in quantiles at the age of 3 to 4 then correlates with their life outcomes at the adult ages after all the other factors have been taken into account in very substantive ways. So that's just one example of how important these types of skills are and how important it is to look at the interventions that we could do. And there's also a lot of work around that this is not something that you're born with, but it's actually a competence, something that you can develop. And again, there's a lot of literature around how this might happen. I'm talking about child programs very much because that's where the literature is essentially strongest. But the same mechanisms seem to apply in a lot of other cases. So whether that's kind of adolescent, whether that's adult relationships, whether that's medical things around doctors being taught how to share bad news with patients or discuss with patients, or workplace settings. All of these things seem to be dependent on a similar set of skills and a similar set of ways in which these skills are developed. In terms of the school-based programs, it's not something that people do in their shed. It's something that's been really widely deployed already, but there's no technology used. Very few people looked at how the existing challenges could be addressed by technology, but there's actually a lot that the programs struggle with that technology can do. And a lot of these challenges are based on the way how the interventions work, how they try and develop these sorts of competencies for kids. And the techniques that are being used now, even in the cutting-edge programs, are essentially the same ones as have been used in the 60s. So you get a person in front of a room, like me, talking to people who are essentially captive audience because they can't leave, and try to explain them something, and then just expect them to go and apply it in their houses. So the methods that you see are things around modeling and posters and rehearsal and role play and simulation. So essentially it's the same thing like me trying to teach you snowboarding by building a little hill that's about this high, having each of you have 3 slides down, and then tell you to go off to Alps and actually do it. So the difference we see, or which is known in the literature, is that a lot of these protective competencies are not knowledge, it's experiential skills. So it's something that you need to learn how to do and try. It's very similar to learning something like riding a bike, where you need this support, the scaffolding, the right sort of situation, and you need to repeatedly fail to learn how to do it. However, the current methods are essentially based on didactic learning. So someone tells you the theory of self-regulation. Someone asks you to imagine, to think back to the moment where you're really angry and then try and calm down. And someone models or gives you videos of examples of someone being very angry and calming down, and that's how you're supposed to learn. However, this is where you actually learn, and then at that point you don't have any support. So that is at the heart of all the challenges, and it's at the heart of how the interventions are built, because they have been built in the 80s, and the only thing they had was a printing thing. They didn't have to write it by hand, but they had printed books, and they had some trainings for trainers. So what we were thinking about was, well, how could we make this better? What are the if we know what the challenge is, if we know that the challenge is how do you support people in learning in the situations that actually matter, what could we do, and is there anything that technology could actually do? And I think the analogy is to the one that happened with programming education, where initially you had this, I don't remember, my parents keep on banging on about it, but you had the thing of you program your code by punching holes, then you submit it somewhere, you wait for 3 days, and then it comes back with a lovely message that says error. And you need to re-punch all of your code. So essentially the feedback loop is really long. You have very little support, and you have very little feedback on what has actually gone wrong. And if you compare it with the model that programming is being taught at right now, very often you have this sandboxed environment where exactly the right type of skill that you're trying to learn is being provided to you. You can quickly iterate, you can quickly have a look at what's happening, and you can essentially gain that skill. We had a paper in 2017 at CHI that talks about a learning sciences, a framework or a theory that seems to underpin all sorts of these learnings, and it's something that Donald Chun, who was an MIT professor, developed in the 80s. And I won't go into the details of it, but it's again the notion of, for all these types of experiential skills, these are the things that needs to happen, and this type of support that we should be providing, which is both in terms of making it actionable and practicable. So what that means is you don't just tell people, when you're angry, calm down. You need to help them figure out how to do it. You need to help them try and do it in the moments that happen as they're going along. And there's also a strong emphasis not on the system solving it for you, but on the system helping you figure out how you can learn and do it yourself. So the outcome is not the emotion regulation per se, the outcome is building the competency of the person to regulate after the system's been taken away. So in that paper we're talking about the implications being that you're focusing on trainable competencies, which is often not what's happening with technology right now. The focus on experiential learning and the notion of intervening quite early and talking about the everyday concerns rather than trying to teach people outside of the situations where they need to apply it. Okay, that's been all really theoretical and admittedly boring. Sorry about that. Now I wanted to just tell you about how we went along and tried to really do these sorts of things. So what does it mean to build a situated intervention for social emotional learning? And the first one that I'll be talking about is looking at helping kids figure out how to be friends with other kids and resolve conflicts in an online environment. And in this case, we looked at the evidence-based programs that already exist in schools and have been developed in the 90s in the US as part of violence prevention programs. They're well known, they're established, they have been deployed in hundreds of schools with lovely outcome measures like reduced numbers of stabbings in the backyard, because clearly that's how you measure success. And our idea was, okay, these programs are relatively boring. They require 12 weeks of practice and 4-hour sessions for the kids. What would it mean to take these programs and embed them so deeply into an online game that kids won't even know that they're learning, but it'll still change the way how they behave with each other? And does everyone know what Minecraft is? Roughly, it's essentially a sandbox game where you can do anything that you want. And very often, all you can do to communicate with other people is text chat. So what that also means is, in contrast to something like a school playground where you have no control whatsoever, here, if you control the server, you know exactly where people are, you know exactly what they've done ever since they logged onto the server, you control all of the communication channels that they have, you can inject support and messages into how they're trying to speak with each other, and you have an existing notion of moderation. So on all of these multiplayer servers, you have a moderator who's there to help exactly resolve conflicts or deal with stuff that's supposed to happen. So the other nice thing about online settings is you get a lot of conflict. So if you put kids into a sandbox space like this and let them be, they will be angry with each other very quickly because someone stole my stuff, someone destroyed my stuff, someone killed me, someone killed my friend, someone didn't kill a monster who then killed me, someone pushed me into the lava. And this is an actual transcript from the server, so the kids get really emotionally attached. So you have this situation where you have full control over the whole environment, really strong emotional situations that are happening, and a set of moderating practices that, at the moment are terrible and essentially rely on people coming in and saying, using a power approach, which is a typology that's taken from prevention science work that has reduced the number of stabbings. But power essentially means you come in and you say, okay, if you don't follow the rules, we're going to have to take action, you're a bad guy, we're going to punish you, and you need to promise never to do that again. Doesn't seem to work particularly well. Doesn't seem to work in real world schools, doesn't seem to work on these servers. It stops the conflict from happening at that moment, but the conflict reappears very quickly afterwards. So what we've done was we've taken the mechanisms that exist in the online, in the real world programs that are often around the types of interaction and the ways how the moderator tries to get the child to figure out what's happening and how to resolve that situation. It's a particular program. We've trained the moderators, we provided them with some sort of information delivery, some sort of in-the-moment support, so they had in-game support of what they could tell the child. It was still very simple, and then we provided them with some sort of a social support tool that they already had on Slack, and we could see relatively strong changes in the moderating culture when we looked at all the conflicts on the server that happened. So this is a year before we started. This is a year and a half later at the point where we started. Then in September to December, we've deployed the intervention, we've tried to teach people. And then in January, February, you could start seeing the shift of how the moderators engaged. And then when we looked at how the kids reply, you could actually see that the same ideas that would exist in real world settings, where if the moderator's using the problem-solving technique, which is the technique from a prevention science program, you had much more positive responses, where positive responses meant that the child was either reflective, went back and tried to redo or reword what happened, went back and apologized and tried to really engage with that situation. And those effects were essentially consistent across all of those, essentially across the two different timing zones that we were looking into. So what that meant for us was that essentially it seems that you can take things from offline programs and transform them into something very different. There was no training for the kids per se. We still don't know if the transfer happens, but we've been seeing qualitatively that kids have essentially led to much more engaged problem solving, so they didn't need the moderators as often. They would try and resolve the situations themselves. And we have another paper in the pipeline that's looking at essentially a specific program that we've designed for the kids, where we've taken out all the technological constraints that are normally put into place. So traditionally in online systems, if you notice that kids are stealing from each other, the solution is not to teach kids not to steal from each other or resolve those situations. The solution is to put in technological constraints so you can't touch other people's stuff. If the problem is kids kill each other, you prevent PvP from happening rather than teaching them not to kill each other. And then they start killing each other's pets, and you can't really solve that technologically because the system doesn't allow you to do that. So that's where the moderators come in. So we've taken off all those technological constraints and brought in this more problem-solving prevention science framework of moderation. and kids had less conflicts than in the original server at all, and were resolving relatively well. It's called Committee for Children, who have a program that's in 35% of US schools in and of itself, so that's kind of our nice pathway to impact. Does anyone have questions about the Minecraft? Cool. So the other program that I wanted to talk about was a second project where we've essentially taken the same idea of how would you take an existing intervention and reframe it in ways that it becomes a situated thing. So instead of requiring in-class didactic learning that expects kids to then go and apply it, as well as having a model where we need to train the trainer who then trains the parent or a teacher who then trains the child, which we know from the prevention science that it doesn't really work. We tried to figure out how could we support kids in self-regulating or emotion regulating without requiring any of this. We went into families, we've interviewed a bunch of people in very low-income settings. The baseline seemed to be that a good way of dealing with a situation where your child's anxious or sad or angry is to tell them to go to their room and come down when they're feeling better. So, they'll cry on their bed for 10 to 15 minutes, 20 at most, and when they're okay, they'll calm down. So we were thinking, okay, that's maybe not the best thing to do. The psychology literature tells us that's not the best thing to do. What could we do to support those kids who are already expected to go out and self-regulate on their own? How can we build something that they would naturally gravitate to, and that would then emanate the emotion regulation intervention? So through some co-design, we built this little fluffy toy that has a few sensors in it, so it knows how you're interacting with it. And instead of training the kids for 8 weeks, we essentially just hand it over to them and say, look, this seems really anxious. Do you feel this really anxious heartbeat? It seems really anxious, but it also seems to calm down with humans. Do you want to take it home and care for it for a week until it can go back to its family? And the kids say, yes, please, thank you very much. I'd love that. And then they take it home. That's the whole intervention, essentially. So how does it work? The idea was that, and I'll tell you why, but the idea was that by having the toy and trying to calm it down, there were about 4 psychological mechanisms that are supposed to down-regulate you. There's something about attention deployment, so all the feedback is really subtle. Unless you pay attention to it, you can't focus. So instead of focusing on, I'm so angry because my mommy didn't let me watch another 2 hours of video, you're focusing on the emotion, on calming down this little thing. There's something about co-regulating, where we know from psychology, if you co-regulate with someone else, you yourself are calming down. There's something about the types of interactions that make the little toy calm down are essentially very slow Zen-like repetitive movements. So the same thing as you would be doing with a rosary, or a Zen exercise where you're playing with little balls or something. And then there's also something about the physiology of touch and having something that's on your body and that essentially has a heartbeat and so on. There's a lot of examples of similar methods that happen in animal-human therapies that seem to work. People don't really know why, but they do. But this doesn't really poop, doesn't run out of the door, and you can just hand it over to a 5-year-old and say, keep it. The idea was that if we're able to achieve this in-the-moment regulation, it might be a pleasurable experience, so we don't have to tell kids to engage with it. They will engage with it naturally, repeatedly themselves. And because they're engaging with it regularly, and they feel that they're calming down, it might change their mindset and coping strategies, because what we knew from the literature and the interviews was that emotion regulation is thought of as weather. The reason why you tell the kids to go up the stairs and cry until they feel better is that you can't control it. It's like, it's raining outside, well, deal with it, take an umbrella or stay home, what can I do for you? But if they're repeatedly experiencing the fact that they can calm down, that's kind of, causing a dissonance in the model, and they might be shifting to more productive coping strategies. So it's a relatively early project. We've sent it out with 25 families, and this is what we're this is what we're finding. So kids seem to really like it. Kids report and parents report that the kids yell at them, like, how dare you drive in the car without Fluffy having a seatbelt? Like, what happens if we hit something? That's, you know, unbearable. Kids actually interact with it quite a bit. So 66 minutes on average during a week deployment, including the school days. And we can see when and how they interact with it. So you see, like, in the morning, then they're off to school, and then they start interacting with it. Saturday, Sunday, the whole day. And then, like, this is where they got the toy, and this is where they had to, hand it off. So in some ways, we're seeing really strong engagement. We're seeing 0% attrition. And we're getting quotes like this from nearly 100% participants. No one, I think every single person talked about how the kid deployed it in their everyday settings, how they used it to self-regulate, how it seemed to have worked. We had a grandparent yelling at the research assistant, how dare she say it's for the children, that she wants it too, and like, don't take it away, it's impossible. Children are crying when they're supposed to give it back, which is something we need to deal with. But the idea is that well, it's generated a relationship, it's generated something that really works. And yes, we have 7, 8 little prototypes that have been sewn by enslaved PhD students in Santa Cruz, which is why we need to take it back from the kids. But now there's a company that's trying to build these things properly, and we'll have the first, like, factory-ready prototypes by the end of May. So eventually, maybe, hopefully, they'll cost like 20 quid, and we can just throw them out at kids and leave them there. Bye. The deputy head of Oxford Counselling Service has stolen one of these units from me and then deployed it with 4 of her patients as part of therapy, and now wants more because it seems to work for university students at Oxford. So it just seems like we've hit something that's not been there before. We need to do a lot of work around, does it have effects, what sort of effects, but at least it seems to work in the situated sense. So instead of getting the kids or the parents to come out and spend 8 weekends, 2 hours each, role-playing how to calm down, we are now maybe able to essentially get the kids change the way how they think about calming, self-regulation through something that's very natural, requires no formal training, and essentially just supports them in the moment where they need to do this. So similarly to the Minecraft interventions, for us it's not just a robot that we built, even though the robot's kind of really interesting. And by the way, the whole AI is a 6 states, single counter that just goes up and down. That's all that's generating all that engagement. And it's just like, have you hit it with a stick? Minus 10 points. Have you nicely and slowly put it and stroked it on its back? Plus 2 points. That's the only AI that's there so far. But the notion is that these are examples that can help us think about prevention interventions in very different ways, and think about prevention interventions as embedded into the environment that people are going through. These are really simple solutions, just because we can get relatively good results with simple solutions. But what could we achieve if we did put in a much more power, much more IoT devices, again in a design that's very sensitive and socio-technically correct and fits in with the needs and learning mechanisms that people have. So this is just to say that's the company that the non-profit partnered with to get this into action. They're a lovely little company that does not have Barack as like their board member or anything, but they built this little diabetes bear that helped kids learn how to deal with diabetes, and it's been successful enough to go and show it to the White House. And now the second project they built was a little robotic duck that's aimed at kids who are diagnosed with cancer, as part of a project that was funded by a big insurance company in the US. Now they have 10,000 of those ducks, and I think the model is that every single child diagnosed with cancer in the US over the next year gets that duck. And the smart toy is now their third little prototype, so we're hoping that it might go well. This is just to say we're fully aware all of the data that I was talking about is really early and really qualitative. It seems that there are some effects, but clearly there's a lot more work that we need to do now moving towards the mental health. So we've built something that could work. Now we need to prove that it works, and we need to tweak the intervention, which is, again, interesting because no one's really built these sorts of interventions before. But it just seems like a nice area to think about. And just to finish off, I wanted to point to a bunch of other topics where the notion of situated interventions and essentially turning the current models of prevention interventions on their head, from like didactic learning to something that's very deeply embedded, could be relevant and interesting. And one of these is a project that's essentially led by, it's a PhD project by someone in Oxford who's looking at how do you help people self-regulate their engagement with digital media, Facebook, Twitter, all these sorts of things. They had I had as well, I was on it somehow. There was a Chi paper, this Chi, which ended up with an honorable mention, but that particular paper is just saying, look, these are all the things that are already out there. There's a psychological theory that talks about what kinds of mechanisms could be useful for people to think about their digital self-regulation practices. And now we're essentially using the data and taking this data and applying to it this situated intervention model to think about how could we help people figure out what works best for them, and how could we do it in a way so that it's not just a browser extension that works for Facebook and doesn't work for anything else, but essentially how do you help people learn how to self-regulate in these settings in ways that are transferable, sustainable, and essentially become a competency rather than just a crutch that, telephone is a great idea, but it doesn't teach you how to talk louder. It just allows you to talk with people who are far away. The moment you don't have a telephone, you're in the same place as you were before. And I think it's a good analogy in the sense that having crutches or telephones is really useful, but if you're talking about prevention interventions, you essentially want to help people build competencies. So the last project that I wanted to mention is something that we're just starting, again, with CFC and Oxford. And it's just thinking about the fact that a lot of people now have digital assistants like Amazon or Google Home devices exactly in the places where they parent. And if there's one protective factor that really matters for mental health, it is the parenting style. And there's a lot of parenting interventions, again, they work as long as people come in for 8 to 10 weeks of weekends, spending 4 hours somewhere, which not very many people want to do. So our idea is to start exploring what would it mean to build a completely new model of parenting interventions that would be created around these agents, around the fact that you can maybe now get in-the-moment support, in-the-moment feedback. How do you do that in privacy-preserving way? It's data privacy and protection lab. How do you do that in ways that empower people rather than tell them that they're bad parents? And how do you do that in ways that people would actually want to use? So how do you tap into I want my child to feel better, I want to have a better relationship with my child, rather than you're a bad parent, you shouldn't do that. We don't know, but it seems like a really interesting area to look at, and there's just been a paper published at Pervasive Health by a group at Harvard who's been working on a similar area, but really within the parenting therapy context, and they've been able to build a little classifying algorithm that's able to classify parent sentences into 8 categories that are essentially based on one of the most commonly used observational scheme that tracks parenting, and also that's underlying a lot of the parenting intervention. So it seems that it's possible that you could start giving meaningful feedback to parents. And similar to digital phenotyping, it seems like the technology is there, but we don't know how to do that intervention. How do you do that socio-technical and learning sciences part about it so that the feedback is actually useful for learning? All right, so just to wrap up, I seem to be really good with time. Just to wrap up, this is just a slide to say, this is why we think prevention interventions are really interesting and a potentially hot and growing area at the moment. And if I had to boil down the stuff that I was trying to talk about today is into a couple of points. These were the ones that I came up with, where it really seems like there's a strong potential for technology-enabled interventions that could change very substantially how prevention science or developmental psychology thinks about how can you help people develop these protective factors. There's really limited research in terms of like innovative technology use, and it seems like there's a bunch of necessary components that are available, and there's relatively not clear but not very fuzzy pathway to developing some others. And what it really seems to be is that because no one's worked in this area that much, you can close your eyes, throw a stone in a random direction, and you hit something interesting in the sense that there's just a lot of problems that are unsolved and might not be as hard as you can see that they can be solved with a 6-state machine. And I think that's it. I didn't check if this list is full, so maybe I'm really sorry if I missed someone. But these are all the people who've contributed to at least some of the work around here. That's it for me. Thank you.